So if we look now at this diagram of cognitive difficulties in people with schizophrenia, this is showing basically a sample of people with schizophrenia and their performance on a variety of standardized tests of cognition. If you look at the x-axis in this figure, you will see that deficits are demonstrated in abstraction, attention, verbal memory, spatial memory, language skills, spatial ability, sensory ability, and motor ability. What's important about these findings is that across all these various domains of cognition, we're seeing deficits that are about 1 to 2 standard deviations below the healthy control mean. What that means is these are fairly substantial difficulties in cognition. In fact, if one were to think about an IQ score, it would be somewhere in the area of a 15 to 30 point reduction in IQ. The deficits are widespread. They're quite significant in size. And if you look at the dotted line on the figure, that dotted line is follow-up of those folks with schizophrenia a year and a half later. And what you can see is even after a year and a half of appropriate pharmacologic treatment, these folks still have the same cognitive deficits they were showing when they entered the study. I should add that this is a study from the Gore Lab 1997 study from schizophrenia research. So in short, what this figure is telling us is several important things. Number one, we've got this vast array of deficits in a variety of different areas. These deficits are persistent, even in the effects, even in the face of treatment. And the deficits can be quite severe. Now, these are means of people with on these tests in people with schizophrenia. So some of the people are scoring better, some of the people are scoring worse, but on average, they're again about 1 to 2 standard deviations, about 15 to 30 point, equivalent of 15 to 30 point reduction in IQ. So let's look at these deficits individually. So attention is a very important area of deficit in people with schizophrenia. It's typically measured in a couple of different ways. In one way that it's been measured is to look at performance on a continuous performance test. We talked about this in the neuroscience section of the course. And this involves paying attention to a target, waiting for a target to arrive, and then typically pressing a spacebar on a computer when the target shows itself amidst a variety of distractor stimuli. That's a CPT. And that would be considered a measure of sustained attention. There are also what are called cognitive neuroscientific approaches to understanding attention. And in these cognitive neuroscientific approaches, ways to understand attention have been related in 2 major directions. One is the deployment of attention. That is to say, if we have multiple stimuli in our environment, if we're seeing colors, if we're hearing songs, if we're also perhaps hearing noise from a heater in the room, picking between these various sources of stimuli and attending to one while shifting out another would be an example of deployment or control of attention. There's a second type of attention, which is the efficiency of attention. And that would be, for example, if you were in your car, you're driving your car, there's the whirring of the engine, there's the sound of the air going through the cabin filter, there's music on the radio, and you decide that you're going to focus your attention, you're going to deploy your attention to the music on the radio. Your ability to remember what you heard in that music would be an example of how efficient your attention is. What studies have shown is that measures of sustained attention that we've talked about, for example, with the CPT, are fairly significantly impaired. Again, somewhere in that 1 to 2 standard deviation range. The ability to deploy attention among different sources of a sensory input also pretty significantly impaired. Again, typically around a 1 to 2 standard deviation impairment. However, the efficiency of attention, that is the ability to process environmental stimuli once attention has been deployed, has actually been shown in several studies to be intact. So you can see in schizophrenia, there are overall deficits in attention, but there may be some areas that remain intact, which is exciting when we think about ways to approach trying to treat some of these deficits. So that's attention. People have also studied what's called episodic memory. Episodic memory are memories that are formed very quickly, but they also disappear very quickly. So a good way to think about an episodic memory would be to think about what you had for breakfast this morning. You probably can remember, if it's not too late in the day, what you had for breakfast this morning. But then the question becomes, can you remember what you had for breakfast the morning before? And that becomes a lot harder. How about 2 mornings before? It becomes even harder. So what episodic memory is, sort of a memory that's typically in a context, right? It's in a time and a place. And it's also consciously recollected. You consciously recollect where you had your breakfast, and you have a conscious memory of that. That's an episodic memory. In studies of people with schizophrenia, people have typically used 2 types of episodic verbal memory tasks. One is are list learning tasks, and the other are prose recall tasks, where a story is read to a client. They have to remember as much of the story as they can. What these studies have revealed has been very interesting. Number one, they've shown typically large deficits on memory, these episodic memory tests. Number two, the deficit seems to be in encoding. That is, when information is presented to a person with schizophrenia, they often have difficulty remembering that information initially or processing it initially. When you look at what folks process initially, and then you look at a delay period, what's called sort of a storage period, storage is usually intact in people with schizophrenia. Again, another promising finding. So on the one hand, there are deficits in episodic memory. They relate to the intake of information, the processing of information, probably interrelated with attentional skills that we just talked about. But the ability to store that information over time appears to be intact. So it's an interesting set of findings with respect to verbal memory. Similar findings have been found for nonverbal episodic memory. People have also looked at the function of language, the ability to process language. And here again, deficits in people with schizophrenia are typically 1 to 2 standard deviations below matched healthy controls. These language deficits consist of skills such as fluency, the ability to produce language. So this is also often tested by giving a person with schizophrenia a letter of the alphabet and giving them a minute to recite as many words as they can in response to that letter. Here again, deficits are typically in the 1 to 2 standard deviation range. The processing of ambiguity in sentences, being able to form a meaning from the context or global meaning of a read passage, is often impaired. Idiomatic expressions, the understanding of idiomatic expressions, is often impaired in people with schizophrenia. So across a variety of different language domains, there does appear to be impairment. There is also something called working memory, and we talked about this a bit in the neuroscience portion of the course. Working memory involves taking in information and then manipulating the information in some way. So it's different from episodic memory. In episodic memory, you're typically passively experiencing something and then remembering that experience. With working memory, you're taking the information, holding it for a short amount of time, and doing something with it. A good example would be remembering a phone number for just, for example, a few minutes, but then actually reversing the numbers of that phone number. You're holding information for a short amount of time and manipulating it. The way this has been often assessed in people with schizophrenia is using a digit span task. This is a task where a series of numbers are read, and then the client has to either read the numbers back directly as they're read, or remember the numbers and then repeat them in backwards order. Here again, we see deficits in the 1 to 2 standard deviation range, typically. So working memory as well appears to be an area of real impairment. Other areas that have been studied have been processing speed, which is doing a visual motor task as rapidly as possible. And these deficits in processing speed have been particularly pronounced. And some folks have actually argued in the research literature that this may be a selective area of impairment, an area where you get greater impairment than in other areas of cognition. Sensory ability has been shown to be impaired. This has been demonstrated with the ability to detect slight changes in frequency of an auditory stimulus, slight changes in duration of an auditory or visual stimulus. And here again, we see impairments in people with schizophrenia compared to matched healthy controls. A task that's gotten a lot of interest in the cognitive neuroscience literature is a task known as the backward masking task. In this task, a stimulus is shown typically for about 10 milliseconds, usually a digit or a letter. There's a delay period of about 30 milliseconds, and then a mask is shown, which is often a series of lines. What's interesting about this task is that the series of lines that are shown 30 milliseconds after the stimulus appear to interfere with the encoding of the stimulus itself, the letter or the number, hence the term for this backward masking. A later stimulus is inhibiting processing of a stimulus that occurred earlier in the sequence. People with schizophrenia, even when these durations between the target stimulus and the masking stimulus are increased from 30 milliseconds to 40 to 50 to 60, continue to show these backward masking effects. And this has been thought, again, to be a disruption in some very basic level of sensory processing. In fact, we'll talk in treatment a little bit about training of improving these basic sensory processes. The idea being that if the basic elementary sensory processing of the environment is impaired, it could be very difficult to create representations of events in one's memory if the sort of sensory stimulation that one is processing is disrupted. So in short, in people with schizophrenia, we've got this array of deficits across a variety of different areas. Now that I've sort of described all these deficits, I think it's easy to think that, oh, people with schizophrenia are just poor at everything, at any kind of cognitive task. But there are actually a few measures where they appear to do just as well as healthy controls. One of these areas is actually in what has been referred to as non-declarative memory or skill learning. So this might be a task where one learns to keep one's finger, for example, on a stylus as it goes around a disc. At first, the finger falls off. It's hard to sort of hold your finger on the top of the stylus, but over time, you become quite good at it. It occurs over a series of trials. It requires no conscious recollection for appropriate performance. And on these types of tasks, people with schizophrenia tend to do just as well as healthy controls. Another area where we see intact experience or performance is on the actual hedonic value or emotional value of stimuli in our environment. An excellent example of this would be the feeling we have when we have a positive social interaction, or when we eat something we like, or we drink something we like. People with schizophrenia appear to have both the same level of arousal associated with these experiences, number one. And number two, they have the same amount of enjoyment of these experiences as people without the disorder. So the ability to experience that type of pleasure appears to be intact with people with schizophrenia, but it's been theorized the ability to represent what these stimuli give someone in the future, that is, what it will be like to eat a wonderful steak in the future, for example, may be disrupted. So while the experience of eating the steak might be intact, the ability to represent what that experience will be like in the future is disrupted. So these are some areas where people with schizophrenia show intact performance. Okay, now that we've talked about difficulties in cognition, I'd like to move to a very closely related area, which are deficits in what are called social cognition. Social cognition, very briefly defined, is basically the way in which we perceive or interpret our social world. Whereas with the measurement of cognition, we're interested in the performance of clients, right, on things such as remembering a series of numbers or letters, remembering a series of words. Social cognition, we're more interested in sort of information processing biases, the way we may be biased to perceive certain aspects of the environment while ignoring other aspects of the environment. Stimuli used in these types of studies tend to be stimuli such as face stimuli, social interactions, and other types of socially related stimuli. Social cognition can be divided up into really four major categories. The first category is affect perception. That would involve recognizing the emotion on someone's face, for example. It could also represent the processing of voice tone or sort of paralinguistic, sort of nonverbal shows of emotion. That's the first category of social cognition. Second category would be social perception, the ability to be aware of social rules in a specific environment, for example, a dinner party. A third major area of social cognition is theory of mind, the ability to attribute accurate intentions or thoughts to outside of oneself, to people outside of oneself. And lastly, the fourth area is attributional style. And attributional style is the degree to which we attribute events to ourselves or to others, or whether we attribute events to the environment. So these four domains of social cognition have begun to be very well studied in people with schizophrenia over the last 15 to 20 years. Studies have revealed that there are deficits across all these different areas of social cognition. Their ability to process affect on faces is impaired. Their ability to understand the social rules that are evident in a specific social situation are impaired. Their ability to attribute appropriate intentions to others are impaired. Their theory of mind is impaired. And their attributional style tends to be overly concerned often with making attributions to others rather than oneself.